episode of the Tiger Den podcast with your host, Kyle Tiger Jarvis. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited about this episode. This is an episode that we already shot once. I had my man Dan here on the TV, and we had him on a video call, and we tried to do this, and the sound just didn't translate. So fortunately, I was able to get him to come into the den in person. So Dan Stevens, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for coming into the den. It's awesome to have you here.
Kyle, it's good to see you.
Cheers, bro.
Cheers, man. It's good to see you, Kyle. I'm so happy to be part of the Tiger Den's launch. And I think I'm the first guest. I don't think you
are the first official guest, yeah.
It's an honor, man. It's an honor. I'm really happy to be a part of what you're doing here.
And that's just it, because there's so many topics that need to be discussed, I feel, these days in, just real, simple, direct, candid terms. And that's why we wanted to redo this episode, because I think it's so important to talk about free speech issues, First Amendment issues. And so there's such a wide array to cover there. We both work in the legal system, the justice system, and we see various incarnations of this in our line of work. But I think today, we want to just focus on day-to-day life in general and how some of these issues that are happening lately are sort of impacting society as a whole. So, there's a lot of stuff to get into. I know social media is sort of feels like kind of the touchstone for all of this right now, because it's become such a ubiquitous part of who we are as a society and how we communicate with each other. And especially in the COVID era, where we're encouraged to maintain even more distance from each other.
Yeah.
I've always said, or at least for a few years now, that social media, it's kind of obvious, but social media is sort of ironic because the idea is that it brings people together. But I think there's something to be said for it pulling people apart, in the sense that it becomes a substitute for in-person human interaction, which, you can't, there really is no substitute for. Certainly over a screen is not an adequate substitute for that. But for better or worse, it has become such an ingrained part of who we are as a society and how we communicate.
I think there's a real danger in if you were lonely in the past, before social media, before the cyber age, I'll call it, you were forced to go out and do something and make friends and see people. Now, I think people can get sort of a fix so that they feel they're being social, or they feel that they're actually interacting with people.
I think you're right, yeah.
And so I don't think it's healthy. But
the illusion of social interaction.
And we might just be cantankerous older men, or I don't know if we're old, but old men, oldish men on this. But I think it's real troubling. We were talking earlier about. I can't help but see a ton of parallels between the Industrial Revolution and how society reacted to the Industrial Revolution, to the Internet age, and how society is reacting to the Internet age. And just, I think we can swear on the Tiger Den. Is that right?
Yeah, it's
okay.
It's
on
not
the free
it's
speech,
not for the kids.
On the free speech episode of the Tiger Den, can I swear?
Yeah.
What a mind fuck, it was. It must have been for the 1890s, the late 1800s, into the early 1900s, all these technological innovations happening, where society is just being transformed at a rapid pace. And then you have the internet coming in the 90s, and all these technological innovations happening through to the iPhones and and all these, and our society being changed at a rapid pace. And it's just weird that it's almost 100 years, like that. That's just weird, but I'm very scared about where we're going to go in the next 10, 20 years.
And we are of that generation that preceded that saw this revolution take place. You
Yeah.
know, we do remember a time before the internet,
Mhm.
before email, before all of it. And it's definitely a different world now. What are your thoughts on what we're seeing now as far as some of the limitations on what can and can't be said on social media, and how, I know it's kind of a dicey, it's dicey territory because these are privately owned companies
Yep.
that are, of course, free to set their own rules and regulations when it comes to this sort of thing. However, it becomes a little bit murky, I think, based on what we've said about how ingrained this has become in our society in terms of how we interact, and then throw the COVID factor on top of that, right? About how, you know, we're encouraged to keep even more space
Right.
between each other now.
Imagine being kicked off. Imagine being 18 years old and being kicked off the social media platform.
For a few days even.
Yeah,
know,
that
it's
you have.
It's like
yeah,
a lifeline.
that you have because you said something that
Right.
that upset people.
So it's this factor, but what I want to say before you get into your thoughts is, for me at least, where it becomes a little bit murky is that these companies, Facebook, are huge lobbyers, and Facebook actually is the #1 government lobbyer right now in terms of money that they spend to get legislation that they want the way that they want it.
Right.
Amazon is #2, and so you go down the list.
Well, they don't want to be regulated.
And big tech is, you know, and they also have government contracts, okay, based on data sharing.
Mhm.
And, you know, we had that big controversy with Facebook with the, I forget the name of the institution that they were sharing, they got caught sharing info with.
The Cambridges.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so this is already, you know, something that they've, you know, been shown to do, and we know that there's tracking, and we know that they have contracts with the defense sector of our government, and so it just seems like,
And it's where people get their news.
right.
I'll admit it. I
Right.
get most of my news from Facebook.
And people criticize that, but I think that's disingenuous, because it's not as if it's Facebook itself that is saying, here's the news today. It's via third-party links and sharing and so forth.
But there's
know.
algorithms that tell you.
They're merely a platform for sharing this, right? But yeah, they have their algorithms and all that. So the line becomes blurred for me about whether, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube, etc., and on down the line, between them, big tech, and government, because the pool there is, you know, there's a lot of the same people
Right.
swimming in that same pool.
Yep.
So it's not technically government that's regulating speech when you get banned from Facebook, but there are some awfully cozy relationships there. So what are your thoughts in general on this very
Well, and
complicated issue?
I think at first you have to back up and say, why do we have free speech? And I don't even mean the First Amendment, which prevents government from curtailing our speech. I just mean, why as a society do we value free speech? And we value it because we know that that's how we advance. We know that the free, the exchange of ideas is how a business grows. Like a smart business owner doesn't surround himself or herself or their self with yes people.
Right.
Right? A smart business person surrounds themselves with people who will challenge them.
Well, somebody tells you like it is, so you know how your business is going to succeed.
This is how we progress. We progress by having the free interchange of ideas. I don't think there's a single important human innovation, whether it's scientific development or civil rights, or expanding liberty to people, that would exist if it wasn't for the concept of the free interchange of ideas. So that's why we want it, right?
It's hard to argue that, yeah.
That's why we want free speech. That's why we want free expression. And so I know it might not be a First Amendment problem if Twitter is kicking people off for supporting Donald Trump, or is kicking people
Or
off,
whatever the reason.
or for whatever reason. And I know we don't like Trump here, but
No,
we don't.
absolutely not. No one here is a fan of Trump. But Facebook and YouTube have also kicked off some leftist groups. The UK's largest mainstream leftist online group was thrown off Facebook without any explanation whatsoever.
Yeah.
So this is the notion as well that I think people need to be careful of. There's, I think, a perception that these efforts to temper certain types of speech on social media is specifically aimed at right-wing groups, and yet we've seen some leftist groups that have also been affected by these policies. So,
and if you allow it to happen to the right-wing groups, if you allow it to happen to your enemies, and I don't mean to use that term, but because
sure,
but if you allow it to happen to people you disagree with, you're going to allow it to happen to you. You're allowing it to happen to you in the future, and people who don't see that are so short-sighted. And these, I don't know.
Honestly, I think enemies maybe is a good term to use in this context, because I think that's the ultimate illustration of how important this topic really is. And it's so important that at the most extreme version of it, someone who is your enemy on the other side saying something that you absolutely abhor and disagree with, but protecting their right to say it. And so, as sort of last time when we had talked about this, and thankfully we're the opportunity to do this again, and thank everyone who's watching right now for being with us. Joe Rogan fairly recently had Ira Glasser on as a guest, who's the former head of the ACLU, which is obviously synonymous with free speech issues and so forth. And so he had made the point that private industries that are acting essentially as gatekeepers, deciding who gets to hear what, and you run the risk of arbitrary exclusions from people's speech reaching large audiences, ordinary people. The only way to remedy this is by law, and to give the government power to regulate what these corporations can do. And all our history shows that if you give government power the ability to regulate speech, you'll be in a lot worse shape than if you allow the private sector to do it. So but again, it becomes tricky territory when the private sector is in bed with the government and potentially sharing that very data. And so privacy becomes an issue, which is a little bit of a slightly different topic.
And these companies and the internet in general, right? You have the difference between, say, email and a social media company, and what you post on social media, you're sending to your friends. I guess if you make your page public, you're sending it to potentially a lot of people, whereas an email is more like a phone conversation. But think about the phone companies. That at some point that could have been privatized.
Yeah.
Or kept private. I
Yeah.
don't know the history of the phone companies.
Sure.
But
yeah.
A long time ago we decided this is going to be a utility that we're going to just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and so it begs the question as to whether it's time to make these utilities, because of how ingrained they've become in how we live our day-to-day lives and how we communicate.
Yeah.
But again, is that handing over control to the government, and now somebody's got to control this thing one way or the other?
Well, but the government has to follow the First Amendment.
Sure.
So
if we give control to them, then do we have
idea.
sort of the Wild West of social media, which I'm all for? Is that what we envision? in a utilitized
Yeah.
social media model.
So there was a case that we talked about last time from 2017, U.S. Supreme Court case, Packingham versus North Carolina. And what I like about it is it wasn't political. It wasn't about a liberal. It wasn't a liberal First Amendment issue. It wasn't a conservative First Amendment issue. What it was North Carolina had a law in place that said if you were ever a sex offender, you are never allowed to use social media. And it was a felony. It was a felony crime for someone who was a registered sex offender to be on any social media site ever. A unanimous United States Supreme Court said that that law abridged free speech.
Yeah.
And that law violated free speech. There was a concurrence. The conservatives concurred. So a concurrence is so there's 9 justices. In this case, Neil Gorsuch, who was Trump's first appointee, who was actually turned out much better on freedom than I thought he was going to be.
Sure, hasn't been quite as
He didn't take part in the case, so 8 justices decided the case. All 8 justices thought that law violated the First Amendment, and so when that a law that said. And it's kind of so the guy that brought the case when he was 21 years old got convicted of statutory rape and became a registered sex offender. He then beat a traffic ticket or a speeding ticket in traffic court years later and bragged about it on his Facebook page that he had just beat the ticket. Well, the cops were so mad that he bragged about it on Facebook that they charged him with this felony that said sex offenders can't be on social media.
Yeah.
And then that's the case that went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And they all said this violates the First Amendment. Liberal, conservative, across the board. Trump appointee, well, I guess no Trump appointees because Gorsuch didn't take a position, but Bush appointees, Clinton appointees, Obama
across
appointees.
The board. Yeah.
They all said this violates the First Amendment clearly.
I mean...
And so if they're going to say that access to these social media companies...
That's a pretty good argument for
the
utilitizing it.
Yes.
I don't know if that's a word, I might be making that up, but that's what it is. And so... I think I'm in favor of that, ultimately. You know, it does seem like the way to go. I feel like it should just be, you can say what you want. And so getting back to Ira Glasser's point when he was on Rogan and talking about these issues and about enemies and why I think this is a good term to use. He said, quote, "People are going to have to understand that they are protected when they protect the rights of their enemies to speak, and that they are endangered when they support restrictions against their enemies, because you can't limit those restrictions and you can't trust who's going to be in power to enforce them." And so the price of our free speech is to be insulted by the ugliness of the speech that we hate. The quick fix doesn't work, and it's dangerous. And so this becomes the ultimate point, I think, in this conversation, because it seems like the current effort to limit certain types of speech is geared towards a goal of not offending anyone and making sure that everyone is unoffended. And this seems not only like a futile endeavor, okay, but an ultimately unproductive endeavor, a hurtful endeavor as far as I'm concerned, because I am of the belief that this is harmful to the arena of ideas, which you've already touched upon. Why a business can be successful and so forth. You don't want yes men, you want people who tell you the truth, because this is how you grow and learn and become better at whatever it is that you do.
Right.
Right? And so ultimately, in the big picture, the arena of ideas suffers, I believe, when you limit the ability of your enemies or whoever it is that you disagree with what they're saying. Because, for example, if someone is barred from saying the most wretched thing that you would disagree with, you are not then sparked with the opposite reactive passion that is necessary as a response to that feeling that exists within our species, our, life as we know it.
Yeah.
And so, to leave those things unsaid, unvoiced, I think is ultimately harmful because it also, by default, ends up restricting and muzzling
And hiding.
the opposite reaction to that.
And hiding them. I mean, I think that's probably the scariest part.
Right. And is it helpful to drive these people into, underground where it just festers?
And then we're like, wait. An election comes and we're all extremely surprised.
Right.
Because no one talks with each other or understands, even tries to understand each other. Yeah, what you're talking about is, I feel like when we were taught civics, and maybe I just have a romantic vision of it, I feel like that idea was ingrained in us about the First Amendment, that we allow the hateful, awful speech because we need to protect everyone's right.
Yeah.
To speak. I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if that's being taught in the same way today, and I wonder how I worry about this, man.
Yeah.
I worry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hate speech is tough. Hate speech is a tough one, and it's
this notion of whether or not we're, and we touched on this before, when we originally tried this before, about is it arrogant almost to assume the right to not ever be offended?
I think
it seems kind of like it is.
I
feel like this builds character. This is how you find out who you are, by being exposed to ideas that that you are not in alignment with. Oh, I don't agree with that. Okay, this is who I am. Without that, I feel like we're going to end up with a lost generation that doesn't really know what the fuck it is.
Yeah. The right not to be offended. We've gone from the right to essentially the right to be offensive to the right not to be offended.
That's it. From Two Live Crew to,
Right.
where we are now. And Two Live Crew was a monumental case in this.
Dude, I remember
respect.
it well. It's one of the first steps in me being interested in the Supreme Court.
For sure, me as well. And I was just a kid at the time, but I remember hearing about it and asking my mom or whatever, and talking about it a little bit, and it's like, and even then, I'm pretty sure, what I remember from those conversations is her saying, some people don't like what some people have to say, but that's freedom of speech, and that's why we have it.
Yeah. And I think those guys were monumental. They did important works, they did important work for free speech. I do think in the late 90s.
Also, Me So Horny is an all-time classic.
I think the late 90s, the Howard Stern, the Eminem, that was, I think I see Howard Stern and Eminem kind of the evolution of, Two Live Crew to Howard Stern.
Sure, yeah.
And I feel like that almost cheapened.
Insane Clown Posse and all this,
I wonder if that cheapened the idea of these kind of shock, that the idea that free speech is about, we should, I get to shock you about how crazy I am.
Right, there's not particularly
and there was not really a lot of
cerebral representations of it. But this is what you get. and this is the arena of ideas. And at the same time, just because these might be popular or getting big ratings or sales or whatever it is, doesn't mean that there aren't other options out there. And this is and so the other thing that the point that Ira Glasser made that I think is, or actually it was Rogan that said during this conversation, is that he always thought that the best way to combat bad speech is with better speech and clear arguments. And that rings so true to me.
And so I get, just to play devil's advocate, because I am on the side.
No, please.
Yeah. What do you say about Nazi Germany? The better ideas didn't win in that situation. What do you say to someone that says,
But they did, because there was a war and it fizzled.
Well, there's a lot of problems before that war, or
here's the thing.
during that war.
I don't know so much as though the ideas behind Nazi Germany were successful so much as it was a sense of fear that was put into people if they didn't fall in line, and that's a very different thing. Or is it? I mean, I think there's a sense of fear that's different, very different. But there is a sense of fear that can be associated with what we're seeing today in this context of what we're talking about, I think, of being ostracized, of not falling in line with what your friends and family think is politically correct or okay to say and not say, and this sort of thing. And so I think there is sort of, we're seeing the beginnings of a very real trend in society where if you're not in line with mainstream views as presented, that you run the risk of being ostracized and labeled this and that and whatever. So it becomes a murky situation.
And when I said, what about Nazi Germany, what I meant was, the idea that you shouldn't allow hateful speech to proliferate because that could be the end result.
I would argue that that's bunk, because it wasn't that all these people were in agreement with Hitler and the Nazi Party's teachings or preachings or whatever it is. It was that they were scared of getting killed. Survival instinct trumps all, and so I think that this is how that was what that ultimately was.
Yeah.
I would argue that that's a false. Whoever says that is trying to, manipulate history.
Sure. Did you see what? So I don't know if you're a fan of The Mandalorian.
I honestly haven't seen it. I haven't been watching a lot of TV shows these days.
So there was a kind of a badass lady.
I've heard it's amazing.
Mandalorian character.
And I do love the original 3 Star Wars movies. I'm a big original 3 nerd. So.
This isn't about Star Wars, whether you like Star Wars or not. There was this character, and she's pretty outspoken Republican. Not the character, but the actor. And that actor, she said, she made a pretty offensive. Offensive's probably the right word, but
Gina Carano.
Comparison, saying, the way liberals are dehumanizing conservatives now. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. I'm not saying what she said.
Yeah, I forget the details,
but
yeah.
she compared the dehumanization of conservatives to how the Nazis dehumanized,
Oh, sure.
Jewish people
Right.
and other minorities in Nazi Germany. She's not allowed to be on The Mandalorian anymore.
Yeah.
She's not allowed to be an actor on that show anymore. She's
Right.
probably not going to be an actor on any show anymore. I think that's insane.
I
think
do
that's,
too.
I think
Yeah.
that's.
Yeah. here's a good example of this earlier, right? You came over, this is the first time you've been over to my house, you know?
Yep.
We're buddies, but you came over, and you're looking around, and I've got a Gran Torino poster. It's one of my favorite movies,
Mm-hmm.
right? Great movie. I think there's some outstanding human and societal lessons in that movie,
Okay.
right? But Clint Eastwood, as a person, right? Not my favorite.
Sure.
Not my favorite, right?
Yeah.
He's, it's to the point he's getting a little bit older. You know, he's a little bit senile, maybe. I don't. You know, he's pretty up there, and it's not clear that he's always with it. You know, some pretty conservative views that I'm not necessarily in line with. You know, but as an actor, you know, and a filmmaker, because I think he directed that one as well.
Yeah.
I think he's amazing, and I think there's some heartfelt stuff to be considered there artistically, and so it's this whole conversation about, you know, human beings are complicated creatures, and it's not necessarily fair or helpful to judge them or compartmentalize them on or label them on
Well, we're going,
isolated
and you're coming full circle to this,
incidents or statements. You know what I mean? Like,
you're coming full circle to like how we're reacting to social media and like how we're handling this.
yeah,
You know, someone puts out a tweet, and that becomes that person.
right,
This character, this Mandalorian actor,
yeah,
writes this tweet,
Corona, yeah,
Carano,
yeah,
and she can't be an actor anymore.
right, right. So,
We're back in?
yeah, I want to
Beer.
get into this a little bit here with big tech. We were just talking about this segment on the Hill that they talked about on Rising, that I watch a lot, and about the Biden administration proposing that big tech be employed, sounds like through government contracts, to monitor social media activity for allegedly extremist posts and so forth. And that does seem a little bit scary in my estimation, based on sort of what we've been talking about. And as they mention on the segment, you know, it's geared towards, it's proposed as being geared towards Proud Boys and right wing and this and that. But as we've already touched on, some left wing groups have also been targeted by these efforts, by Facebook, by YouTube, where their pages have just been straight up taken down with no explanation whatsoever. So,
Yeah, I think it's a good idea if you're going to let the government do something, if you're going to give the government the power to do something. Think about the person you would want the least to have the power to do whatever you're giving the government the power to do.
right,
And if you can handle, you know, if you can handle your worst nightmare with that power, okay, maybe that's a power we should talk about giving the government. But if you can't handle your worst nightmare, if you are anti-Trump, or if you are anti-Biden, or if you are anti-somebody else, if you couldn't handle that person with that power, then we should not be giving any of them that power.
right. So, because for most people that means somebody on the opposite side of the political,
Right.
you know, two-party system.
And I just, you know, I think that we could get into the two-party system, but
Right.
we're just one of the.
Somebody who's ideologically opposed to you.
Yeah, we've been set up into teams and camps, and it's very easy to just fall into that. We've become, I think, more tribal with our politics than ever before. And so, yeah, it's just
So
we're
imagine
gonna
that person calling the shots.
we're in charge now, so we're gonna make a bunch of laws about the people that we think are gonna hurt the people we don't like. Well, guess what? That law goes into effect, and that law is in place until the law gets changed.
Yeah.
And maybe when the people you don't like get in power, maybe they like that law now to use against you.
Yeah. There was a good example of this actually on the Rogan episode with Ira Glasser, formerly of the ACLU, that where he talked about there was this campus group. I forget the college where this occurred, but a campus group, a Zionist group of Jewish students who were had a group of students that were members of this group, and they set up. This group was instrumental in setting up an anti-hate speech, ordinance or whatever it was on campus. And like a year later, within like a year, that group was targeted by that very policy and shut down. And of course, they didn't think that they were, spreading any kind of hate speech or whatever. And I don't know the details of whatever it was that was said. I don't know. I'm not going to weigh in on whether it was hateful or not. But the point is, they set this up with intentions of, a certain nature, and ended up being the targets themselves. And it speaks to what you're saying, where it depends on who's calling the shots on what's okay and what's not, and there's really no telling at any given time or moment. Certainly never, it's hard to imagine perfect alignment.
Right. Well, and there's no question, the story you were originally talking about, that the Biden administration is hiring outside firms to monitor social media. There's no question that that's an attempt to circumvent the First Amendment. There's no question. I don't
hard to see it any other way.
Right. And boy, if that's okay, when someone you don't like's in charge, it's also going to be okay.
That's the truth. So, if we're at this place where, we're trying to limit the ability of anyone to basically be offended by anything, okay? But we know that's not going to work, ultimately. It's just not. It's just not. You can't regulate offense out of life.
No.
It's just not feasible. And so we know that. And so even though as a society it seems that we've yet to admit this, all right, let's go with this notion that we're able to admit that this is ultimately not going to work. And so what is the answer? I think personally that when it comes to social media and so forth, and we talked about turning it into a utility and letting it just be free reign, and I think that that's ultimately it, because
Has to be. Right?
it's the arena of ideas, and you can't have limitations on that. You have to battle speech that you don't like, or bad speech, or hateful speech with better speech, rather than by suppressing the speech that you don't like, or the ideas that you don't like. And so what's your thoughts on this when it comes to, say, Trump, where Facebook has extended the ban? I don't think they've made it permanent or whatever yet, but they extended it. He's still not allowed. I think Twitter, does he have a Twitter ban as well?
I believe he does.
So, this speaks to what we were talking about earlier, about whether it's productive, helpful in any way to drive these voices, vile as they may be at times, and Trump is as vile as it gets at times, right? But is it helpful to drive that underground? I say no. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree with you. I think the idea is probably that the argument would be that Trump crossed a line with you know, the
Capitol
speech
raid.
that led to the Capitol riots.
Sure.
And that crossed a line.
Let's talk about that. What are your thoughts on that? Because it's murky territory in terms of he obviously towed the line when it comes to what he said and how it
No,
can be interpreted.
he had definitely been advised by lawyers about the fighting, the so-called fighting words doctrine in free speech, and you know, in the free speech jurisprudence, and by jurisprudence I mean the cases that have developed about free speech and fighting words, and whether you can incite a riot or incite a fight or incite violence. There are certain tests about what you can and cannot say, and it is absolutely clear that when he gave that speech having been prepped on where the lines, where the legal lines are and where they aren't. I think he was very happy that it happened, but that's just me. I'm going.
No, for sure, but I totally agree. In my opinion, that's strictly based on the fact that, you know, he's kind of a narcissist and likes any attention that he gets, and
Yep.
I think that any idea, any notion of anything that's centered around him makes him happy.
Right.
And so I think he's just happy to, at the idea of this kind of support rallying around him. But in the end, the idea of banning him from social media.
He hasn't been convicted of a crime.
And he hasn't. As crazy as that is, he's.
No,
I personally think he's liable for several. I would say the same thing about Joe Biden, honestly, and it is what it is. But
right. If you take
he
someone
hasn't been convicted.
he's someone who did something that's unpopular with a lot of people. But he's never been convicted of any any crime for it.
Yes.
I think that's a dangerous place to put, and I know they're private companies, and I know right now they can do it, and I'm not saying they don't have the right to do it. I just think it's a dangerous precedent to start setting, that someone did something that I disagree with, but there was no conviction, and I run a company that is as broad and powerful as Facebook or Twitter. I'm not sure as they should be allowed to ban people who haven't been convicted of anything because they don't like the speech that was spoken.
I agree. You know, and one of the people that I love to invoke when it comes to this topic is George Carlin, and because a lot of this centers around tolerance and the idea of tolerance, and what individually and as a society we're prepared to tolerate, and I think he's got, you know, a lot of good things to say.
There's some great George Carlin quotes out there.
Yeah, and one that I took down for this discussion was when he said, "Political correctness is America's newest form of intolerance, and it's especially pernicious because it comes disguised as tolerance. It presents itself as fairness, yet attempts to restrict and control people's language with strict codes and rigid rules. I'm not sure that's the way to fight discrimination." And I'm not sure it can really be said any better than that. And
Really good.
And along with Ira Glasser's comments on the Joe Rogan podcast about you know, when we limit the ability, you know, when we limit our enemies' speech, we harm ourselves and our abilities to give our own speech. And so, yet here we are today, where the focus
careful so that we're not offending anyone. But it's clear that this is a snowball rolling downhill. It's gonna smash into something at some point, right?
Yes, I mean, political correctness, it's important. So the idea of political correctness, I think that term itself is so loaded. Don't be a dick, don't be an asshole is a good, I think that's a good
Yeah.
lesson or
It's tact.
concept,
Right?
yeah, or concept to impart.
It's tact.
Don't be a dick.
Yeah.
Don't be an asshole.
Read the room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where I think, I mean, just people, I think, get very righteous in what they think is polite, and they impart those values onto everyone. And I'm not talking. I'm just, expecting someone who's 70 years old to speak the language you want them to speak when they've talked away for 7 decades.
Yeah. Right.
And just expecting them to change their language for you in this moment. I think the people who disagree with me would say that's necessary, and we can't get change without this kind of radical action. But I just think you're losing a lot of people who might be with you when you do that. You're losing when you start talking down to people like that and making them feel lesser because of what's in their brain and because of the thoughts that they're having.
Yeah.
You have no chance of bringing them along with you on whatever movement
Yeah.
you're trying to go with or proceed with.
I agree. It's like a child almost in that context. You wouldn't say, a child can't be expected to know, the ins and outs of everything. And so, but in terms of the way that people may have had certain ways of thinking imposed upon them by their parents, or the way that they were raised, or these antiquated ideas of perhaps racist thoughts and so forth, right? And so, or ways of speaking that might be perceived as such, okay? And so, in the sense of a child who says something that they're not necessarily aware of the impact of what it is that they're saying, you wouldn't say, hey, listen, you piece of shit,
Right.
You can't fucking say that. If you ever say that again,
Right.
we're gonna fucking.
That's a good analogy. I was wondering where you're going with that.
We're not gonna let you say anything ever again. No, you would say, hey, listen, it's not okay to say that, and here's why. And I think when it comes to antiquated thinking that we wanna evolve from, that we have to take a more measured approach, because it's more ingrained than in certain areas of the country and in certain contexts, in certain communities, then this kind of approach is going to do anything about.
Yep. It reminds me of when I went out to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. I don't know if you've ever been out there. It's beautiful. Beautiful place.
Well, I spent some time in a week in the Seattle area, Everett, Washington area. My boy, Derek Rudolph, who helped me get this podcast off the ground. Shout out every time. From here until the podcast ends, I will never resist an opportunity to say thank you for inspiring this. So,
Nice.
Yes.
Thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
Getting Kyle to get this going. So I'm in my early 20s. I think I'm I'm in my early 20s. I think I'm the shit. I think I know everything.
We all did at that time.
I'm pretty the environment was a real big thing for me. I just was very passionate about the environment.
Same, yeah. I always had this thing too. Yeah.
And so
I can relate. Yeah.
I'm out there, you know, in the Olympic Peninsula, which is just a beautiful part of the world. And we go to this diner, me and the folks I was with. And the diner was a great little diner of locals. And it was just anti-environmental stickers everywhere. Just anti-environmental stickers everywhere. And I'm just thinking, why do they hate environmentalists so much? And you know, and then you think about it, and you said, well, actually, they had their communities, and whether it was logging, and I don't know what the issue was in that.
Yeah, I think ultimately we have to turn, as you said, maybe the internet as a whole into a utility, and certainly social media has to be looked at for that. But yeah, it ultimately comes back to us as people and why it is that we value free speech, like you talked about, and you know, it's the ultimate sort of human right, as I see it, to express oneself and be able to say something, be able to use your voice to say things and express ideas.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the content of those ideas might be. And I think ultimately that's kind of the point. And so, you know, if we know that in the end limiting certain types of speech and certain platforms isn't going to achieve the end result, because we know that. We know
People will be offended.
we know ultimately that you can't prevent people from being offended. They're always going to find a way to be offended. Somebody's always going to find a way to take issue with something. So since we know that that's ultimately not going to work, even though that's the direction that we're going in right now, eventually we're going to get to the point where we realize that that's not going to work. And so what do? We utilitize social media and possibly the internet as a whole.
Make those platforms follow the First Amendment.
And make those platforms follow the First Amendment as it would under, because it's going to be government regulated at that point.
Right.
And so they'd have to follow the Constitution, and it just becomes an open, completely wide open forum, as I think it probably should be.
Right. And I don't think, you know, obviously there can be parental controls, and there, I mean, one thing to think about, which we haven't talked about, is like, at what age should people be being exposed to all the crazy ideas?
Sure, but that feels like more of a parenting issue.
That's a parenting
Right.
issue, right? I agree with that.
So what other answers do we have? You know, it starts to get complicated because there's so much money involved, changing hands between big tech and government right now. There's such a big force when it comes to lobbying and exerting their influence over society and government. What are some steps in your mind maybe that can be taken, whether legislatively or otherwise, aside from...
So this is a jump that has nothing to do with, well, it has something to do with free speech tangentially, but it's not about free speech. But we haven't had a constitutional amendment since the early 90s, and that was like a ministerial amendment that just said the senators and the Congress people couldn't give themselves raises.
Yeah.
Before that, I mean, we're talking about the 60s, maybe the 70s, when there was anything substantive done, where as a people, the country got together, because to get a constitutional amendment, you need 2/3 of the, I don't want to say it wrong, but you need a vast majority of people to come together and say, we need to change this.
Yeah.
I think campaign finance, so Citizens United
Sure.
is a case that said campaign finance is protected First Amendment speech.
Yeah.
And so ironically in the free speech episode, I'm going to talk about restricting some free speech here and say, I think we need a constitutional amendment that takes campaign finance out of free speech.
Well, because I challenge the notion to begin with that it is speech of any kind.
And we could agree with that, but the Supreme Court said it is.
Right.
And like, if you like...
But ironically, it ends up limiting certain kinds of speech by lobbying for certain types of legislation and policy.
I just think that's something everyone can get behind too.
Yeah.
I'm not the politicians.
Yeah.
But I don't know as there's a liberal, conservative, moderate who doesn't agree. We should take big money
Out of politics.
Out of politics.
Yeah.
And then you have the money that big tech is lobbying our government with.
Yeah.
To protect themselves and keep themselves to, a private entity that can make profit. That at least their lobbying influence goes away. Whether the laws get changed how I think they should or we think they should, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, you asked what I think could be done.
Yeah.
That's what I think is we got to start getting. And I just don't know who disagrees with that. That we shouldn't be able to regulate how much money politicians are given in their campaigns.
Yeah.
Because you're obviously going to owe something to the person that gives you a bunch of money to help you get elected.
Well, we haven't seemed to figure that out yet because we keep playing that game,
Yeah.
and these politicians end up beholden to whatever special interest it is that is the big dog on the block, and right now that big dog is big tech.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess that's probably where we're at and what it's going to take.
There's also, I guess, the idea of considering them monopolies, and I'm not going to, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on, when the railroads got broken up.
Yeah, yeah.
But you could start considering these, I think you could easily start considering these companies as monopolies, and that, and I wonder if...
A couple of hot mics, I think. It was a Google exec or Facebook maybe that caught on a hot mic saying it's too big. It's too big. You got to break it up.
Yeah?
Yeah. So there's antitrust laws, but they don't seem to have a lot of teeth when it comes to the big dogs,
Yeah.
especially the big tech, because like in Facebook, they own Instagram.
Yeah.
Google owns YouTube, I think. So, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of competition in these markets, and so you have a concentrated group of people who are at the very tippy top of the lobbying totem pole, shaping policy. And this bleeds into our daily lives as users of social media and the internet and so forth.
Has to. And I want to be clear, like lobbying, I think it's a good idea that if the government's going to, or if our Congress or our state legislature is going to make a law about farming, that there's a group of people who advocate for farmers.
Sure.
And have a role in how whatever law gets passed. I'm not saying lobbying in general. I think that's a misunderstood.
But the problem is that what it means is money.
Well, and that's where the problem is.
It should just mean ideas.
Right. You're not advocating when it becomes an obvious, to use the phrase from the first impeachment thing, quid pro quo. When it becomes an obvious, we are paying you money to enact legislation that we want.
And that's
the problem.
This is not hyperbole. This is literally how our government operates. Mm-hmm. Large businesses and corporations pay very large amounts of money.
They write the legislation sometimes.
And literally hand those bills over along with sizable financial contributions to political campaigns, to super PACs, etc. And it's wink wink, and but not even so much because this is all out in the open, but it seems that we're still not fully aware as a society of exactly how pervasive this process is and how directly it impacts something as basic as freedom of speech
Right.
in this context with big tech and how influential they are in government.
Or are we aware and just feel powerless to do anything about it?
That could be. I mean, it's a big animal, so
Yeah.
is there a certain segment of the population that just says, well, hey, it is what it is, and so,
Yeah. I'm telling you, a constitutional amendment. We need to start.
yeah,
It's time. It's time. You're 40.
yeah,
I'm 41. It's time our generation starts really, imparting values that we have.
a constitutional amendment that says, that essentially writes the money out of politics.
That says all it would have to say is campaign finance or states and the government and the federal government have the right to regulate campaign finance.
That it's not protected speech. To
It's not protected by the
spend as
First
much
Amendment.
as you want, and
Right, because so what happened is there was a McCain-Feingold statute
Yeah.
that passed that really did do a lot to keep dark money out of politics and really did a lot to curtail lobbying efforts. And Citizens United, ironically named, was a group that challenged this and said, no, it's our First Amendment right to give, campaigns and political causes as much money as we want. And, the Supreme Court said, you're right, that is your First Amendment right.
yeah,
And so, not to talk about another thing that's very, well, I was going to say Roe v. Wade. I like that decision. I don't want Congress to be able to write a law that overturns that. And so when people say, hey, we should overturn Citizens United, it's like a common progressive congressperson thing to say.
Sure.
I'm going to work to overturn Citizens United. They
Yeah.
love to say that.
yep,
I don't like that. I like that, like when the Supreme Court says we have rights, I don't think Congress should be able to do something with a statute. I think we need a constitutional amendment that says we can regulate campaign finance. We can say we can limit the amount of money that gets pumped into campaigns.
yeah,
And that's not protected speech. And that way you're not diminishing the constitutional right to free speech. If Congress tries to pass laws that gets around it, it's just kind of, again, it cheapens the concept and the whole process. I think it's time we start doing things like that. It's a hard to get 2/3 or 3/4 of the country is what you need.
yeah.
To agree on anything is tough, but that's something I think a lot of people would agree with.
I think so too. There's the current climate seems like maybe it's right for that, but it takes the right politician or mix of politicians to band together to say this is what we're going to do. And
Yeah.
so, maybe it's time to start pushing and supporting candidates like that.
Yeah.
So that
maybe
that
the
seems like a
Tiger
good
Den
start.
Tiger Den will spark something here. I don't know.
Hopefully that'd be great. And yeah, it's a tough nut to crack because it's such an ingrained part of what our political system has become. But that does sound like a good start. So yeah. Well, man, thank you for coming in. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too, Kyle. Happy to be a part of this.
It was a fun conversation. A good time, and I hope that everybody listening got something out of it. And certainly, this is a conversation that we can continue at another time. It could certainly be a multi-parter. So hopefully, we'll have you in the den again soon.
All right.
And
It wasn't
I
that,
look
I
forward
was
to
a little scared of the den, but it's all right. It's all right.
that. It's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's good here.
it's not too wild.
No.
All right,
It's
cool.
all right.
Yeah, that's good.
All
That's
right.
good.
Cheers.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in to this episode. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to posting some more episodes really soon. And until then, thank you for watching Tiger Den Podcast, and stay safe out there and question everything, always. Thank you.